Imagine you are a city official. The year is 1518. In the streets outside your window, dozens of your citizens have been dancing, uncontrollably, without stopping, for days. Some of them are bleeding through their shoes. Some have collapsed from exhaustion and gotten back up again. And you have a decision to make. You could clear the streets. You could call for prayer. You could order bed rest. Instead, you open the city treasury and you hire musicians. Have you ever heard of the dancing plague of 1518? Most people haven't. And of those who have, almost none know what the authorities of Strasbourg actually did when it started, or how that decision transformed a strange crisis into something far darker. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just why hundreds of people couldn't stop dancing, but why the people in charge may have made everything so much worse. To understand what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, you need to understand the world those people were living in. This was the Holy Roman Empire. Strasbourg sat on the western edge, a prosperous trading city, but one that had endured years of brutal hardship. Famine had struck the region repeatedly. Disease moved through the population in waves. Syphilis had recently arrived in Europe for the first time. The harvest had failed. People were desperate, frightened, and, in the language of the time, spiritually overwhelmed. It was into this world that, sometime in July of 1518, a woman stepped into the street and began to dance. Her name, according to the records that survive, was Frau Troffea, though you'll find her name spelled several different ways across historical documents. Troffea, Troffea, Troffita. That variation comes from the nature of medieval record-keeping, not from any confusion about who she was. What is not in dispute is this: she danced. She danced through the afternoon. She danced through the night. She was still dancing the next morning, and within days, others had joined her. Within a week, the number of dancers had grown to somewhere between 30 and 50 people. Within a month, chronicles of the period report that figure had risen to as many as 400 men and women, all of them caught in the same compulsive, unstoppable movement. Now, it's worth being precise here, because the historical record is not. The 400 figure comes from chronicles written after the fact, not from a precise head count taken in the street. Historians treat it as a credible estimate, not a verified number. What the records do confirm is the scale of suffering. These people were not dancing joyfully. They were not celebrating. Witnesses described them as hollow-eyed, exhausted, sometimes weeping, and yet unable to stop. Their feet bled. Their joints gave out. And some of them, according to those same chronicles, did not survive. Here again, the numbers are contested. Some sources claim as many as 15 people died per day at the outbreak's peak. That figure appears in multiple accounts, but it originates from chronicles written decades after the event, not from contemporaneous city records. What we can say carefully is that this was not a harmless spectacle. People were dying, or at least people believed they were dying, which in a terrified medieval city amounts to nearly the same thing in terms of social impact. So what was causing it? That's the question that has occupied historians ever since, and the answer is more complicated and more human than you might expect. For a long time, the leading popular explanation was ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, and it contains compounds chemically similar to LSD. Consume enough of it, and you can hallucinate. You can convulse. You can lose control of your limbs. It sounds like a perfect fit. But there's a problem, and medical historian John Waller, who wrote the definitive modern account of this event, identified it clearly. Ergot poisoning restricts blood flow to the extremities. Someone genuinely suffering from ergot toxicity would not be physically capable of dancing for several days in a row. Their legs simply wouldn't work that way. The ergot theory, while still widely repeated online, has been effectively set aside by the historical consensus. What Waller and other scholars have concluded is far more unsettling in its own way. This was almost certainly what we would today call mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which genuine involuntary physical symptoms spread through a community. Not through a virus or a toxin, but through fear, suggestion, and shared belief. The preferred clinical term today is mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. What was once called mass hysteria is now understood as a real and documented phenomenon, observed in communities under extreme psychological stress. And Strasbourg in 1518 was, by any measure, an extremely stressed community. But here's where the story gets a layer most people miss entirely. Because if mass psychogenic illness explains why the dancing started, it doesn't explain why it kept going. And for that explanation, you need to look at what the authorities did next. The City Council of Strasbourg convened to address the crisis. They consulted physicians, they consulted the church, and then they made their decision, their diagnosis. The afflicted needed to keep dancing. The movement, they reasoned, would purge whatever was causing the illness. Stop the dance and you trap the sickness inside. And this is documented in the surviving treasury disbursement records from the Strasbourg Municipal Archives. The city of Strasbourg spent public money hiring professional musicians, pipers, drummers, fiddlers. They constructed a stage, reportedly in the grain market and the horse fair, and they set up a dedicated space for the dancing to continue. They even brought in healthy people to dance alongside the afflicted, to keep them moving. Let that sink in for a moment. A government watched its citizens dance until their feet bled and responded by hiring a band. What happened next should surprise no one. The dancing spread further. More people joined. The outbreak grew worse. The authorities had, with the best of intentions and the full weight of their institutional authority, poured fuel directly onto the fire. And this is where the story of the dancing plague of 1518 stops being merely strange and starts being something darker. Because this is not a story about superstition alone. This is a story about what happens when frightened institutions respond to a crisis they don't understand by doubling down on the wrong answer. Now here is the detail that changes everything and that almost no account of this story gives proper weight to. On the 28th of August 1518, the Strasbourg City Council issued a new set of ordinances. All music in the city was banned. All public dancing was prohibited. The gambling houses were shut. The brothels were closed. In other words, they reversed everything completely. The same institution that had hired musicians to accompany the dancing now outlawed music entirely. And historians note that shortly afterward the outbreak did begin to subside. The dancing plague faded as the summer ended. There is also one other element worth mentioning because it is vivid, it is colorful, and it deserves the caveat it comes with. The physician Paracelsus visited Strasbourg some 8 years after the outbreak and offered his own theory for how it began. He believed that Frau Troffea had started dancing deliberately to embarrass her husband, and that other women of the town, seeing her deception, began dancing for the same reason. This is a fascinating detail. It is also a single source, written 6 years after the fact, by a physician with a well-documented tendency toward moralizing. Present it for what it is. One man's interpretation, not established history. The dancing stopped. The city recovered. And the strange Strasbourg choreomania of 1518 passed into the historical record, largely forgotten for centuries, occasionally surfacing as a curiosity, rarely examined for what it actually reveals. What it reveals is this, that the dancing plague of 1518 was not simply a medieval oddity. It was a case study in how communities under extreme stress can generate collective suffering, and how institutions, acting with authority and certainty, can make that suffering dramatically worse before they make it better. Historians also note something striking about the geography of these events. Almost every episode of dancing mania recorded in Europe between 1374 and 1518 occurred in the same region near Strasbourg, on the western edge of the Holy Roman Empire. Why this region repeatedly over 140 years? That question has not been fully answered, and for some researchers it remains the most intriguing part of this story. The dancing plague of 1518 is a strange chapter of dark medieval history, but it is not ancient in the way we like to think. Collective fear, institutional overcorrection, a crisis made worse by the people tasked with managing it. These are not medieval problems, they are very human ones. So what do you think? Was the Strasbourg City Council simply doing the best they could with what they knew? Or is there something more troubling in the story of an institution that watched people suffer and decided the answer was to hire musicians? Leave your take in the comments. I read them, and this one is genuinely worth debating. If you found